Hello and welcome to Before You Die, a podcast about movies and whether or not they are worth the precious, precious minutes of your life that it will take you to watch them. My name is Ben and I will be your host as I dive into all the movies that have been included in the 1001 Movies to Watch Before You Die book series. By all movies, I do mean every movie that has ever been included on any edition of the 1001 Movies to Watch Before You Die book series. So, accounting for movies that get bumped off the list in newer editions to include newer movies, the grand total of movies included in the 1001 Movies to Watch Before You Die book series is 1160 movies. I'm going to start with the oldest movie on the list, Journey to the Moon, and work through them chronologically by release date. This is all, like, my opinion, man, and as such, it is absolutely infallible. Also, I will be talking about the plots of all these movies, so spoilers, whatever. Typically, I will be diving into one movie per podcast, but given how short the first two movies on the list are, today is going to be a 2-for-1. First up is La Voyage dans la Lune, and that will be the last time I try to pronounce the title in its native French. From here on out, A Trip to the Moon it is. A Trip to the Moon was written, directed, and pretty much everything by, here comes a little more French, Georges Méliès. Méliès was a stage magician who owned a theater in Paris in 1895, and when after seeing a Lumiere Brothers cinematograph said, "I have got to get me one of these. Woohoo!" He built himself one of these, and over the next couple of decades, Méliès would start his own film production company and direct over 500 movies, many of which he would show at his theater as part of his magic act. Imagine the characters from The Prestige making movies, and that's going to get you pretty close. And if you're a weirdo, you can imagine Edward Norton in The Illusionist, if you prefer that movie for reasons I don't understand. Méliès had a long career, but he did suffer a commercial and critical decline into the early 1910s, which is exacerbated in part by the eradication of the French film industry during World War I. He made his last movie in 1912. Méliès was broke and seemingly forgotten by the mid-1920s, but the film industry around that time and critics slowly began to discover and rediscover his work, and apparently they found him in old folks' homes, specifically for retired filmmakers, which I did not know was a thing, but it sounds incredibly French and awesome. Nowadays, Méliès has many fans. These include the Smashing Pumpkins, which recreated A Trip to the Moon in their music video for Tonight, 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 and Martin Scorsese, who centered his 2011 movie Hugo around the rediscovery of a print of A Trip to the Moon, and in the context of the film, reinvigorated film fans' appreciation of Méliès. Back in 1902, though, Méliès was hitting his peak. A Trip to the Moon was the movie that would bring him international acclaim, and even get him ripped off in the US. Good old rip-off USA. Although that's really just kind of a general film thing. I don't think the US gets exclusive credit for that. Anyway, inspired by Jules Verne and H.G. Wells, A Trip to the Moon is exactly what it sounds like. It starts with a bunch of bearded French wizards in an astronomy club building a rocket and propelling themselves to the moon. They encounter a strange ecosystem populated by tribal aliens whom, after a brief moment of gawking, the quote-unquote scientist promptly murder. Now, in the scientist's defense, or whatever you want to call them, the aliens die really easily. It's like any physical contact and they explode into a cloud of dust. So, they didn't go out of their way to murder this other species, but they did it, and it wasn't great. And scientist is definitely in quotes because, as best I could tell, there's not a single test done on the moon or a sample taken of any of the robust flora, fauna, or rocks on the moon. An alien does hitch a ride on the rocket back to Earth, and the alien is rewarded for its intrepidness by being imprisoned and paraded through the streets for the enjoyment of the citizens of Grand Paris. The anti-colonialist message would have been very on point for France in 1902, but really the whole movie is an exercise for war and, frankly, still are a pretty dizzying and inventive set of special effects. The most famous shot is the one in which the moon takes a money shot to the eye vis-a-vis a rocket ship, but that is far from the only highlight. There is mechanically operated scenery, pyrotechnics, film splicing to transform and disappear objects, along with a cacophony of costumes, masks, and constructed set pieces. So there's the movie, but so what's the final verdict? Is this a movie you should carve out some time to see before you die? Now, if we want to be pedantic, we could call the early 1900s the primordial ooze, or if we want to be super pedantic, we could call it the pre-embryonic period of movies. But the bottom line is, movies were rife with possibilities around that time. Pretty soon, the basic format for movies is going to be figured out in the middle teens, and it's going to be roughly the same still now. I mean, there's aesthetic changes, content changes, but the basic skeletal outline of movies isn't going to change a whole lot from like the three act structure. But when Melee's made movies, there really were no rules, there were no set processes, there's no boundaries. Things felt limitless. And so Melee's vision, it really did put him far ahead of not just his peers, but frankly, a lot of other filmmakers. And part of this might be because, his prints of a lot of his movies were destroyed and used in the war effort in World War One. So a lot of it didn't survive for other filmmakers to use, to see and be inspired by. But in that first half of that 20th century, I can't think of many movies that are as visually, in terms of visual effects, as exciting or as fun as A Journey to the Moon. So it really does feel like way, way ahead of its time. A lot of old movies are going to be considered great because of their historical context. So, this is the first movie that had this kind of shot in, or made this narrative choice, or tweaked narrative, changed movie making, captured the zeitgeist, inspired a bunch of copycats, whatever. Those kind of claims and historical context is going to be true for a lot of movies on the list. There's going to be a lot of movies that were relevant at the time, inspired other movies. There's a lot of movies that are popular at the time, but that's can't be enough to make a movie worth the time to watch it in terms of all-time film history great. So you need something more than just being able to say something like, "Oh, A Journey to the Moon." It's got the genetic material that eventually would lead to Star Wars or something, which is great. I mean, love Star Wars, but you need something more for it to be a movie that's worth your time rather than just being historically significant. So, a couple of things. I glossed over the anti-colonialist message. It does feel inescapable here. We're talking about a bunch of explorers murdering and capturing a quote-unquote uncivilized group of people, which was made by a Frenchman in 1902. And this is when France was absolutely still at its colonial peak. So I don't think this is fishing for some sort of deep hidden narrative. I think this is clearly what's going on in the movie. And none of this is vital. Although anytime a movie has really kind of a deep, interesting point of view that's part of it and doesn't hit you over the head with it, it's great, and it's added bonus points. But as important, probably more importantly, the Journey to the Moon is an eminently watchable movie. It's only 16 minutes long, so if you see it and hate it and you've wasted your life based on some weirdo on the internet's recommendation, it's only 16 minutes. You've wasted time on dumber things, I'm sure. But the craft and effort that went into making it is apparent in every shot. It's not boring to look at. It doesn't have much on characters. Characters going to kind of come in a decade or two where that's going to start to have a little bit more personality. But it doesn't matter. The visual effects, I think, are still fun to look at and watch. 118 years later. This is 118 years have passed since this came out, and it's really spotlighting a very interesting and idiosyncratic time in movies, and it's just fun to watch. So yeah, I definitely think it's worth it. Give this movie a watch. Now we hop forward in time one whole year to 1903 for The Great Train Robbery, the next movie on the list. Before we do, though, let's talk about the film's director, Edwin S. Porter. Porter started working in the movie business right around the time there was movie business to work in 1896. He worked for a company that sold Edison films and viewing equipment before touring the West Indies and South America as a projectionist for a rival film company. He followed that with a year curating Edison films at a wax museum in New York, and by 1899, Porter was primed to take over film production for the Edison Manufacturing Company. From there, Porter would spend roughly the next decade as the most influential filmmaker in the United States. Porter took charge of just about every aspect of film production, from writing, producing, directing, filming, editing some 200-ish movies, and he helped popularize a number of new cinematic techniques, most notably the dissolve. He also helped create the boom for Nickelodeons in 1905, largely because of this movie. Brief aside, Porter was there for pretty much the entirety of the Nickelodeon era from beginning to end. Nickelodeons were the primary viewing experience of movies for, let's say, a decade, perhaps a little less. starting in 1905, before movie theaters and feature-length movies took over the industry. Initially, movies were seen as part of a vaudeville show or in peep show, quote, boxes. Another aside, peep show boxes probably make you think of a place in France where the naked ladies dance, but peep show boxes are another name for Edison's kinetoscope, which were roughly the size of a small cabinet with viewing, peephole at the top to see the moving images inside. And as demand for movies increased, this was not a tenable way to watch movies, so businesses started popping up that would acquire the prints of several short movies. They'd be spliced together, curated, sometimes narrated by the folks at the theater, and people would be charged 5 cents for admission. Hence the name Nickelodeon. By 1909, Porter he'd had enough of the seemingly endless demand for content to fill these Nickelodeons, and he left Edison Manufacturing. He started a couple of other film production businesses that didn't pan out, and then he worked for another film company for a little bit, but the film industry had kind of moved on from him stylistically. Brief aside, Porter did direct Mary Pickford in her first film. Now, Mary Pickford is a name you have probably never heard, and frankly, I barely have heard of her. But, as a footnote, she was one of the first megastars of the silver screen, who certainly did not make it past the silent era. Another little factoid, Porter Studio also directed the first two films roles for John Barrymore, who is the grandfather of Drew. Now we go, though, to 1903. Before all that, The Great Train Robbery was a game changer. The movie was shot entirely on location, which just means not in a movie studio, with 10 different indoor and outdoor scenes. Movies had really never been able to generate a sense of place like this before. There's a scene in a telegraph operator's office, dynamite exploding inside the train. There's a pan of bandits riding on horseback through a forest. There's a holdup outside the train, and my favorite, a camera strapped to the top of a moving train so we can watch the robbers in action. This was really probably one of the first movies where you weren't just seeing something trick or manufactured or that was clever but seemed fake. It's really this was like you were watching something as it happened. You're really there for an event, and it probably felt much more real than a lot of things you'd seen. Now, given that the train robbery ends in the perpetrator's death, you can decide for yourself how great it is, but indisputably, the movie features a train robbery from beginning to end. It starts with a telegraph operator forced to stop a train at gunpoint. The robbers get on board. They murder a couple of train operators, and they blow open a lockbox. They have the engineer stop the train. Passengers get off, and they're robbed. And we get even one passenger panic and try to run away, and he is shot. Another aside. I am here for very badly filmed fake deaths with what looks like a cap gun and somebody wincing over with no bullet wound in pain, and it's great. We're a long ways away from convincing deaths by shooting, so I love these fake deaths. The locomotive, though, back to the robbery, the locomotive is disconnected with the robbers on it. After a little ways down the track, they hop off, and they have horses waiting. At the same time, the telegraph operator is awoken by his daughter, who is bringing him lunch very sweetly. So the telegraph operator runs out of the telegraph office, and he interrupts a rather bitchin' hootenanny at a saloon so that he can tell the sheriff about the robbery. A posse is formed, and the robbers are shot. You throw in a random shot of one of the perpetrators shooting a gun at the camera, and there you have the movie. So where does that leave The Great Train Robbery? Should you make yourself an accomplice and watch the movie? Some advertisers for the movie in 1903 described it as absolutely the superior of any movie picture ever made. This was probably not just total advertising nonsense at the time. If you had come into a movie in 1905 with just everything that had come before it, I'm sure seeing a train robbery as it happens was probably the most electrifying cinematic spectacle at that point. But here's the key point. It isn't 1903 anymore. I can list a few reasons why The Great Train Robbery is important historically. You can cite the on-location filmmaking, the new cinematic language that this film helped develop, which really helped make sense of a complicated sequence of actions, more complicated than predecessors, at least. This movie would drive movies as an economic and cultural force, help make them popular and mainstream, push movies towards longer narratives. You can even argue The Great Train Robbery laid the groundwork for film as we know it. And yet, shrug. Because for all of that historical importance, when you watch this movie, it feels like a rusty relic that has been buried in the mud for 100 years. Now, the movie doesn't have any story or characters to speak of. This is fine. Neither does A Trip to the Moon. But the whole point of this movie is really just the spectacle of it. It's, oh my God, it's a train robbery. Holy cow, have you seen it? It's a train robbery. And none of that stuff holds up even a little bit. I mean, comparing it to even movies that it helped spawn in a decade or two after it, and it feels way antiquated when you just think of where movies are going to be in 10 or 15 years after this movie comes out. It feels way behind those movies. So add to it all the other stuff that's come since, and it feels quaint. I kept trying to think of an analogy, and this is the one I kept getting stuck on. So I was thinking of the Sugar Hill Gang song Rapper's Delight, which is fun and sweet. That song, though, was released in 1979. Hip-hop wasn't really a mainstream music industry at all. Rap wasn't really a thing that people consumed and bought records for. There was not really a rap industry to release songs in. And along comes this song, Rapper's Delight, and it really helps pave the way for, rap as an economic force, as a cultural force. And that's great. And you can be glad that it came along, but the trouble is you compare it to stuff that came out after it, and I kept thinking in contrast to NWA's Straight Outta Compton. Well, that movie came out less than a decade after Rapper's Delight and is way more fun to listen to. It is way less antiquated. It actually, well, sadly, it's still on point as well, but it just doesn't feel like the late 80s. That record, is great, and it's really fun to listen to. Rapper's Delight feels like it's from 1979, and it did something no other track had done to that point, really. But I also feel like, probably some other rap song would have been released and been popular. There's no guarantee you're ever going to get something as great as NWA. So if I'm thinking of, rap songs or hip-hop songs you need to listen to, does Rapper's Delight make the list? I don't know. If it does, it's just because you're saying, hey, this is historically important, not because that's a vital track that is super fun to listen to. And really, A Trip to the Moon and A Great Train Robbery, I had similar thoughts comparing those two. Although A Trip to the Moon came out 1 year before The Great Train Robbery. And The Trip to the Moon, it feels much more inventive, timeless, transcendent, vital, all that stuff. The Great Train Robbery feels like a really old movie that just happened to do something before a lot of other really old movies. And things were going to get there eventually anyway. But this one just got there a little bit before the others. And, it's not very long, and I grant that you've probably seen longer and shittier movies, but no, you do not need to see The Great Train Robbery before you die. And so there it is. This is the end of the first podcast. If you want to watch either of those movies, they are on YouTube and probably a variety of other sources. You don't need to worry about copyright right now. Everything is in the public domain, and we're going to be there for a little while. You do have to worry about crummy transfers, but you're probably going to be able to watch it for free somewhere. A little production note here. I am working on a website and ways to throw some money my way. If you want to help me legitimize this whole operation, that's awesome. If not, no worries. I am a weirdo, and this is fun for me. So I plan to keep chugging along, whether anybody listens or gives me money or not. I'm also happy for any feedback. So if you want to tell me that I'm absolutely wrong, my movie takes are awful, or you just want to tell me that I am a pathetic loser with a very lame podcast and that I should kill myself, well, I would be delighted to hear that feedback from you. So, up next, the vampires. Bye-bye now.